Hello to everyone who is logging in. Thank you for joining us for today's Missouri Prairie Foundation webinar. We will begin in just a moment. Good afternoon and welcome to our Missouri Prairie Foundation webinar, Take a Virtual Hike on the Prairie, Fall Edition with Bruce Schuette. My name is Emily Gustafson, Missouri Prairie Foundation Operations Coordinator, and I want to thank you all for joining us for this webinar today. Today's presentation is a pre-recorded video with Bruce Schuette, filmed on September 2nd on MPF's Friendly Prairie. Bruce is here with us live for a Q&A after the video. During the video presentation, if you have any questions for Bruce, please put them in the Q&A section only on your screen. And at the end, I will read those out to him after the video concludes. This webinar is being recorded, and the link will be shared with all of you tomorrow, along with resources mentioned during the presentation and Q&A session. And now for some background on Bruce. Bruce Schuette retired from working for 36 years as a park naturalist at Cuivre River State Park, where he was involved in natural resource management, prescribed burns, invasive plant control, ecosystem management, natural resource inventory, collections, monitoring, working with researchers, and nature education. He has served on the MPF board since January 2000, served as secretary 2005 to 2012, and is Vice President of Science and Management and Chairman of the Science and Management Committee. We are excited to have Bruce here today to show us around the prairie and to share his prairie knowledge with us. And now let's take a hike on Friendly Prairie in Pettis County with Bruce Schuette.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Friendly Prairie. This is where our spring virtual hike was, and so we're back again to take a look at it much later in the growing season and see what's out now and how things have changed. So Friendly Prairie is a 40-acre prairie about 10 miles south of Sedalia. There's a whole great little cluster of protected prairies right in this immediate area, including Friendly Prairie here. Just to our south is Lordy Marker Prairie, and then Drover's Prairie that MPF own. A little bit farther to the east, there's Paintbrush Prairie, which is a Conservation Department prairie. To the north is Grandfather Prairie, another Conservation Department prairie. There's a really nice private prairie to the east, and then a little bit farther to the south we've got some other prairies. So there's a very nice cluster of prairies right here in this southern Pettis County area. So Friendly Prairie is a 40-acre prairie. Historically important, it is the first prairie that the Missouri Prairie Foundation acquired for protection back in 1969. So this has been a nice place for people to come and visit and learn about the prairie for quite a long time now. Now, this is just a small part of what had been very extensive prairies in this region. Friendly Prairie is in what's called the Osage Plains. It's a natural division of Missouri in the southwestern part of the state, and this is where the most extensive prairies in the state occurred. In fact, it's kind of interesting. Where we're standing right now is about 60 miles from Kansas. So if you just head straight west from here, about 60 or 61 miles, you'll come to Kansas. And when the first European Americans settled this region, you could have actually walked from this spot to Kansas, and if you'd have taken a little bit of a circuitous route to stay on the high ground and out of the stream valleys, you could have walked from here to Kansas and never went through woods at all. You could have stayed on prairie that whole 60-mile stretch. If you did go in a straight line, you'd have had to cross just a few little kind of narrow wooded corridors for stream valleys. But 60 miles west of Kansas, almost all prairie. If you'd have gone to the east of here, just about 10 or 11 miles, you would have come to sort of the eastern edge of the Osage Plains. So this was the area that had the greatest extent of prairie historically, and the Osage Plains still have most of the prairie remnants that remain. But we are pretty close to the eastern edge of the Osage Plains now. So like I say, about 10 miles to the east. The most extensive prairies kind of ended there, but there was still prairie farther to the east. However, at that point, you kind of start getting into the rougher topography of the Ozark Highlands. As you get that rougher topography, fires didn't burn quite as intensely across the landscape, and up and down the slopes, and and there were natural fire breaks with the rivers and streams. So at that point, it became more wooded. Fire still burnt through, but it was like open savanna and open woods, and there were still prairies to the east, but they were mostly restricted to smaller areas on the ridge tops. So this is kind of near the eastern edge of the really extensive prairies that stretched from here out to Kansas and then just continued on west through Kansas. Here we have one of the relatively few things in flower right now. This is a sessile-leaf tick trefoil, and typical of the tick trefoils, it's in the legume or the pea family, and it has the little sort of pea-shaped flowers on it. They're kind of white to sometimes a little bit of a pinkish tinge to them. But this is one of the tick trefoils. It's called sessile-leaf tick trefoil because the leaves, which have 3 parts, but there is very little stem at the base of the leaf, and so sessile means like no stem, and so hence the name sessile-leaf tick trefoil. And typical of the tick trefoils, the seeds it gets are these what are a lot of times called beggar's lice, these little kind of flat sticky seeds. There's a number of species of tick trefoils, several out in prairies, some in the woods, and they all produce these kind of seeds. So I'm sure anybody that spends time out in the wilds during this time of year through the fall is probably very well acquainted with them because of the seeds. However, it's nice to note that there is actually a nice little flower on these plants also. And here we have one of our native thistles. It's kind of hard to tell for sure between a couple different species, but we know that it's a good native thistle because if you turn over the leaf and look at the underside, if it's strongly whitened like this one, you know it's one of our native thistles. If it's not sort of whitened on the underside but just a plain green, that would be one of the exotic thistles that is an exotic problem along roadways and and that. But this one is one of our good native thistles, and it's a great nectar plant for insects, especially this time of year when there's not quite as much else in flower. Well, this time of year, the tall grasses kind of dominate the scene out here in the prairie. However, there's a lot of different hidden gems when you get out here and really kind of start looking down to the ground, looking underneath the grasses. And one of the most characteristic ones this time of year is a downy gentian. And a downy gentian is just this beautiful bright blue flower. It's also a really good plant to find because it's one of our really remnant dependent species. So it's not one that's likely to show up in a disturbed habitat at all. But out here, being a remnant dependent species, when you find it like this, it generally is telling you that this is a good prairie community that this one kind of helps point out. Definitely one of the fall highlights for our prairies. Here's a nice plant to find out here, typically blooming this time of year. This is the rough white lettuce. Kind of looks like some of the other wild lettuces that you might be familiar with. This one is in a different genus, but the flowers do look similar. Just that these are kind of a cream color. So it's rough white lettuce. This is another one that's a really good one to see out here because it's a remnant dependent species. So another one of those characteristic species that you don't find just any place. This one right now seems to be very popular with some of the beetles up here pollinating it, and so a very useful plant for the prairie community. Okay, here we have one of the prairie grasses. It can be pretty common in some prairies, but it's certainly not one of the larger ones that stands out like the big blue stem and Indian grass. This is prairie dropseed. It's got sort of like clumps of foliage with very thin leaves, so it's a pretty dainty looking clump of grass. And then these are the seed heads for it. So again, nice open, kind of dainty looking seed heads on this prairie dropseed. And then right over here is a native foxtail that you find in our prairies. So it's related to, but a different species than foxtails that are weedy and found along roadsides and that. This is a native one which is frequently found in our prairies. Kind of a noted time for several different kinds of asters to be blooming on our prairies. We're still a little bit early, it seems, for a number of them. However, we did just find one actually in flower. This is the azure aster, or I believe it's also called the sky blue aster. It's again a remnant dependent species, so a good indicator out here on the prairie, indicating the quality of this as a remnant old growth prairie. This is the sky blue or azure aster. Of course, anytime when we visit the prairie, there's going to be some things that are in flower, but also a lot of things that are not in flower at that time that either were previously in flower or will be coming out later. So when we were here last time, it was before a number of our real characteristic prairie plants were in flower. We may have seen a few of the plants, but they weren't in flower or were very small. And in the since we've been here, a lot of things have been going on out here in the prairie. And so a lot of those things that then come in and bloom midsummer, they're past flowering now. And so if they were successful, they'll be in the process of producing their seeds. But we can still see the plants now. We saw them. If we saw them before, it was before they were in flower. Now they're past, but it appears they have been successful. So in this group, we have things like, this is purple prairie clover. Now, the purple prairie clover, the leaflets are very fine, and we'll see if you can maybe tell how finely dissected they are. And we can compare that to the white prairie clover later on, which the leaflets are a little bit wider, not quite that thin. We have things like our prairie blazing star, which is of course one of the most characteristic plants and one of the prettiest wildflowers we have out here. In the length of time since we were here before, the plant has grown up this big. These spikes at one time were just covered in tiny little purple flowers, giving you this purple spike. And so now it's producing its seeds. We have the cream wild indigo we might have seen before, just as a smaller plant, but this one presumably was successful in producing seeds, and so this is what it looks like now that it's going dormant. Over here we have rattlesnake master, again one of our most notable and distinctive of our prairie wildflowers. And then right next to that, this is the pale purple cone flower. So again, presumably, hopefully all these plants were successful, but that's why it pays to check out a prairie a number of times during the year, because whenever you come out, there will probably be different things in flower. There will be a lot of changes, and just since our last virtual hike in the spring, all these plants have come up, produced, basically gone through their life cycle, flowering, producing their seeds, and now they're getting ready for winter, but they have produced their seeds and thereby hopefully have had a successful season. And in that same category of flowering in between times we've been out here is this one called round-headed bush clover. It is actually a species of Lespedeza, and while when some people hear the word Lespedeza, they think of Sericea, which Sericea lespedeza is one of the greatest exotic species threats we have to our tallgrass prairie. It can really come in and take over a site and really degrade the prairie. So that's one of the things that we're very vigilant for, is keeping the Sericea under control or out of our prairies if we can. And so our prairie manager, Jared Hubner, spends quite a bit of time checking all of our prairies during the summer, even checking them a couple different times to try and find and treat and control any of the Sericea. Fortunately, Friendly Prairie has not had much of a Sericea problem, and so we're vigilant in trying to make sure it stays that way. But not all Sericea, or not all Lespedeza, is the bad Sericea. This one, the round-headed bush clover, is a native. It produces seeds which can be good food for quail and other birds, and so it is just a really good plant to have out here in the prairie. Just make sure you don't confuse this for the bad Sericea lespedeza. Here's a couple more species that are typical for blooming kind of during the middle of summer, so we didn't get a chance to see them on our previous visit, and they're gone by now. But there are several here that are very good remnant-dependent species. This is what's left of blue hearts, American blue hearts. This one you almost never find outside of a good remnant old growth prairie. Right here is lead plant. a very sort of characteristic plant of the tallgrass prairie. And then we also have here one called finger coreopsis. This one during the summer had yellow flowers, but the leaves have a very distinctive shape, and so it's easy to tell this finger coreopsis. The lead plant, the flowers were a deep purple when it was in flower, where it's producing its seeds now. And then on the American blue hearts, it was a bright blue flower. Just flying across, we just noticed a dragonfly, one of the larger dragonflies. I think it was one called a green darner. And it's interesting, you'll a lot of times find dragonflies flying over prairies, even though they have to go to a nearby water source to lay their eggs and for their nymphs to grow up in the water as little aquatic animals. But they will frequently fly pretty long distances to fly over prairies hunting insects for food. But the green darner is also interesting because it's migratory. And so from here, they will fly down to southern states to spend the winter. So unlike many insects that either overwinter as eggs or larvae or hibernate, that's one that migrates south and comes back then the next year. Kind of zooming across there, that was a regal fritillary, and that's one of the really important insect to have out here on our prairies. Regal fritillaries are, first of all, they're state listed as a species of conservation concern, and they've just been proposed for federal listing as a threatened species. But regal fritillaries are ones that really depend on high quality remnant prairies because they lay their eggs near, and the larvae feed on violets. The few kinds of violets that grow out here in the prairies, which I believe we saw at least one of them or a couple of them on our spring walk. And so that's what all of their larvae eat. The little caterpillars eat just those little violet plants. And so they really depend on prairies like this. And Friendly Prairie is known as, and all the prairies right around here are known as kind of hot spots for the regal fritillaries. There's been and is ongoing a number of research projects looking at them and documenting, trying to figure out how common they are and how stable their population is. And so this is a really important area for them. Apparently earlier in the year, when we see them out a little more often and like stopping at flowers and nectaring, that's frequently the males. But this time of year, only the females are left. And you'll see them flying by like that, but we don't see them landing and nectaring much, if at all, this time of year. The females, mostly when they fly, they'll just disappear down into the grass and the low vegetation. And apparently they kind of hunt out where violets are to lay their eggs near the violets so that their larvae then can find the violets after they hatch. So we see them, we've seen several today go flying across, but then every time we see it, it goes over a little ways and just ducks down and lands in the vegetation. Here's both a very attractive wildflower out this time of year and also a very interesting one. This is called false dragonhead, although it's also frequently called obedient plant. And apparently the way it got its name obedient plant is it's interesting that if you take the flowers and kind of move their position, it'll stay there. so it seems to be fairly obedient in how you kind of move the flowers around. So again, this is a good one. This one is typical for late summer and into the fall, and not always, but usually in kind of wetter areas in the prairie. Here in the prairie, we've got several different kinds of milkweeds, and of course, milkweeds are in the news a lot lately because of their importance for monarchs. But a number of them are found in our prairies, and they're also very good part of the prairie community for other things too, not just monarchs. But here we have one called the tall green milkweed, or now sometimes called the prairie milkweed, bloomed kind of middle of the summer with small little green flowers. But here we have one of the milkweed pods. So this would be a source for milkweeds for the future. Okay, one of the giants of our tallgrass prairie, it's not a woody plant, grows up from the base every year, but this is compass plant, a member of the sunflower family, the genus Silphium. And compass plant is, as you can see, very tall. It gets these big yellow sunflower-like flowers, so it's a very noticeable and attractive part of the prairie during the summer when it was flowering. Like a number of the things we've seen, it's past flowering now, but it is producing its seeds inside these heads, and gets its name. The leaves from compass plant are very distinctive. They're very large. They're kind of divided, lobed, but the lobes are very wide, so it's got that very distinctive kind of web look to it. Supposedly, I think these leaves are supposed to line up in a certain direction. These are maybe north-south. I don't know if that's the way they're always supposed to be or how true that is, but supposedly that's where it gets the name compass plant. It was also interesting because this plant, I've heard especially on the flowering head, if something breaks part of the plant off, it'll kind of exude kind of a gummy, sticky sap. And this is something that the Native Americans, and maybe also with the pioneers moving out on the prairies, that the kids especially would take and get that, and they could chew on it, and it would become just like gum. So an interesting way that people use this plant, as well as I believe it was used medicinally and that some too. But compass plant, a very interesting and characteristic part of our tallgrass prairie. And then here's one that is in bloom now. This is a really interesting plant. This is also another one which is very much a remnant dependent species. So another really good one to see out here. This is one that is called upland white aster. And it kind of looks like a little aster. However, it is not listed as an aster anymore. It is actually considered to be a goldenrod, and so it's actually in the genus Solidago, the genus of goldenrods, and that's what this plant is. So this is actually technically a goldenrod, even though its common name calls it an aster, and in fact it used to be listed as an aster, but now it's considered to be a goldenrod. But with these white flowers, pretty little plant, but also a really great one to have out here, knowing that it's another one that shows us what a good remnant prairie this is. Okay, here we have another type of goldenrod. This one is called showy goldenrod. And showy goldenrod is another remnant dependent species. So it's one of the goldenrods which is kind of the most remnant dependent out on our prairies. When it does open up, it's got very large showy flowers. This is one that, even though most of the things we've seen are definitely past blooming for the year or else out right now, but this one has yet to flower. So probably in the next couple weeks, the showy goldenrod will be in bloom. Down here in this draw, we have a nice little clump of the curly-topped ironweed. Ironweed has these real pretty clusters of purple flowers. This one on the bracts, they're very long and thin, kind of drawn out, and oftentimes curl kind of over on top. And so it's called curly top ironweed. And this is one of the most remnant dependent ironweeds. This is actually a remnant dependent species where most of the ironweeds can be found pretty much across the landscape in old fields and roadsides and that. This one is a pretty good indicator here. Here we have a beautiful golden garden spider or yellow garden spider or black and yellow argiope, a number of common names for them. They're pretty widespread, but it's a big, beautiful spider that you find out in grasslands late in the summer. And this one, as you can see in its web, it's caught a cicada. So that's its current meal. So this is, we're just really fortunate to have a chance to see this spider and its prey out here on the prairie. Okay, here's what's left of a white prairie clover. And on the white prairie clover, you can see that the leaflets, the division of the leaflets, are still pretty narrow, but they're much larger, noticeably larger than on the purple prairie clover we saw just a bit ago. Okay, a little bit harder to see and photograph when we're out on the prairie like this, some of the wildlife. Fortunately, we did get a chance to see some things. There's a lot of insects around now. We got a chance to see the regal fritillaries, and there were some birds out here too. Did see dick thistle still hanging around. There were a few scissor-tail flycatchers around the prairie, an eastern meadowlark, and some sparrows out in the grass, and goldfinches calling. So even though it's harder to film that for the virtual hike, we did have a chance to see some wildlife out here too. Okay, standing here in this really nice patch of rigid goldenrod is a pretty nice place to end our virtual hike on Friendly Prairie today. It's really too bad it's a virtual hike because for early September, the weather today is just outstanding, about 80 degrees, low humidity. This is just a gorgeous late summer day to be out on the prairie, and so too bad it has to be a virtual one, but you're welcome to come out and visit Friendly Prairie and almost all of the MPF prairies that are open for people to visit, have a chance to see and explore the wonderful prairie natural communities we have protected here.
All right. Thank you, Bruce, so much for spending a beautiful afternoon out on Friendly Prairie. so that we could share this gem of MPF's properties with folks on the webinar today. We do have a couple of questions already in the Q&A, and I do want to encourage folks who have additional questions for Bruce to please put them in the Q&A window on their Zoom. So Bruce, the first question that we have is about burns on Friendly Prairie. And so how often does Friendly Prairie get burned? And also what does a typical kind of MPF burn plan look like? So that folks kind of understand what the prescribed burns, how we plan our prescribed burns on the prairies.
Okay, well, and first, thank you for Emily for spending time out on the prairie and doing such a great job of taking the video and following around the little critters and getting pictures of them and putting all that together for this virtual hike. So thank you for your role in putting this all together. As far as burns on the prairie, with Friendly Prairie, like with most of our prairies, we first of all, we don't burn the whole prairie in any one year, but we usually try and burn a part of it each year. So somewhere, depending on what works out good for that particular site, sometimes between like a quarter or a third up to maybe like half the prairie gets burnt every year, but that rotates around then. So basically a particular spot on the prairie is typically getting burnt every 2 or 3 years, with part of it each year, and then also with an unburned site, an unburned part of it for especially for a lot of the insects or animals that may be spending the winter in the leaf litter and that may not be able to survive a fire, but there will always be a refuge there for them. Now, as far as I guess you might say, like preparing for the burn, we decide well ahead of time what part of the prairie is going to be burnt. Jared Hubner, our director of prairie management, is really in charge of that, and so he has a plan for what parts of the all the MPF sites are going to be burned, and then either he or working with contractors in that, they will prepare fire lines. Usually that's mowing areas that will be the fire lines that are where the prescribed burn stops. That's how we keep it under control. And then it's a matter of waiting for the right time. Burn plans state in there like what the weather parameters are. So a range of temperatures and humidities and wind speeds and wind direction. And then it's a matter of waiting for those conditions to materialize, watching weather forecasts and that. And then in our case, where we've only got 2 management staff, Jared also coordinates with other people, volunteers, sometimes even MPF board members that will come down and help with the burn, so we have enough staff because it has to be done in a very safe manner with equipment, water available, but enough staff to be able to operate it to carefully and safely burn that particular part of the prairie.
Thank you, Bruce. We have a question that is another question that's related to weather, but more of kind of big climactic changes. So have you noticed any effects of the recent drought on the wildflowers or on our prairie communities more generally?
If you're referring to like this year, I haven't been out enough to know of any particular case this year. And most years, just kind of normal droughts and dry summers and stuff, the prairie is well adapted for that. Last year, I believe it was, or maybe it was 2 years ago, there was some parts of western Missouri that got very extreme drought. And I noticed on one of our prairies, not Friendly Prairie, but another prairie kind of early in the summer, things were really kind of looking drought stressed, like they were really kind of drying out and just didn't have the kind of growth that you normally expect. So early in the summer, it was really kind of looking pretty noticeable, the effects of the drought in the prairie. But then they did have some rain. I was back there later in the summer and everything looked great. So so again, the prairie plants are pretty well adapted to our normal climatic conditions and can deal with things within, you know, certain parameters. But they're usually able to deal with dry times of the year and even some pretty severe droughts and stuff, and still come back as soon as the rain picks up again.
Thank you, Bruce. So we had a couple of questions about what you mean when you say something is remnant dependent. So how do you define a remnant dependent species? And does that mean that those plants are mostly found only on remnant prairies?
Yeah, remnant dependent, that's basically what it means, is that they depend on the remnant prairie conditions. So once the ground has been seriously disturbed in that, primarily, they oftentimes can't survive. There's also a scale that has been developed by botanists and ecologists for many areas, including Missouri. For Missouri, this system was developed originally by Doug Ladd, and then most recently, Doug Ladd and Justin Thomas published a paper that kind of talked about this system where plants are rated on a scale of 0 to 10, and that kind of is on how faithful they are to natural communities. And so that, you know, fits right in with the idea of being remnant dependent. On the scale, plants that are like 0, 1s, 2s, 3s are usually kind of like weedy native plants. They are native. They were found in prairies originally. They're definitely a part of the prairie system and belong on the prairies. However, they don't really tell you much about the history of the area because they can tolerate quite a bit of disturbance. So they can also pop up in old fields and on roadsides and all sorts of disturbed areas. Scores in the middle, like 4, 5s, and 6, which are what most of the plants where I think we looked at that weren't actually remnant dependent, but those are still kind of the heart of the natural community, or the bulk of the natural community. The prairie grasses and that most of them fall within that range too. So that kind of makes up the bulk. But then the plants that are given scores of like 7, 8, 9, and 10s, those are plants which basically that scoring is saying that these are plants that are very faithful to remnant natural conditions. They just don't, when the system is seriously altered, they're gone and they don't readily come back because they are in other remnants. But now in our landscape, remnants are oftentimes very far apart. So if they're destroyed in one remnant, there's not another source close by, and so they're not probably ever going to get back again. So this is also, we feel, gives them added sort of conservation significance as we try and protect the total biodiversity of the system. If something happens to partridge pea and it blinks out in a spot, no worry, it's all over the place. But if something happens to like those blue hearts or that white upland aster or those kind of plants, if they disappear at Friendly Prairie, they're going to be gone from everything that's not prairie in the immediate vicinity and probably lost to the system forever. So if we're trying to protect the total range of biodiversity of all parts of the system, those are the ones we have to sort of make sure and protect the most, because they're at the most risk of, if they disappear, not being able to come back and reestablish themselves. So that's one of the reasons I mentioned that we like to see those, because they are very much a part of the original remnant, sort of seriously altered aspect of the prairie. And when you find those, you've got a good remnant prairie. It's not just an old field with some of the prairie grass that's come back into it. You've really got a part of that system. And like in Friendly Prairie, our total species list for the prairie is just over 300 species. So there's a lot of diversity out there. But of those 300 species, about 37 are remnant dependent species. And so those also are telling us, if there's that many remnant dependent species there, we know we've got a very good example of that remnant prairie community protected there, that not only has a lot of plant diversity, but it also has those elements very much restricted to an altered remnant or old growth prairie natural community.
Thank you, Bruce. Question, kind of just to clarify what we're talking about when we're talking about a remnant old growth prairie. What does that mean? Does that mean that it has never been plowed or broken up? Or how do we define a remnant or old growth prairie?
Yeah, remnant or old growth prairie, basically that's it, a prairie that's never been plowed. Because once it becomes plowed, well, we're now looking more and more at prairies as old growth natural communities. Prairies are long established, they're very stable, but most of it is underground. So a lot of times when people think of old growth, they think of a forest with big trees. But now we recognize that a grassland can be basically the same. It's just that those elements that last for maybe centuries are not trees above the ground, but the plants and basically their root systems below the ground. So we can burn off the top of it and they come right back. If they're mowed, if somebody cuts it for hay, it'll still come right back. The part that's really surviving for a long time is below the ground, the root system, which apparently, fantastic root systems in prairies, and that's all very stable with the roots from all these plants. And while it's nice to see the plants flowering and producing seeds and reproducing this year, most of them don't really have to. These are very long-lived plants. So they're not annual plants that come in, pop up real quick, go to seeds, and then they're done. These are plants that depend year after year on their root system. And so it's very much an old growth system. It's very stable with these very stable, long-lived elements. It's just that we don't see them sticking up above ground. We see them come up new each year. But the really old growth part of it is that very stable root system. And so after a prairie is plowed, then that's all messed up. And, the community is destabilized. It's in chaos. But otherwise, we can use the prairie. Of course, we manage prairies for their biodiversity. But prairies have been used, and why we still have prairies oftentimes is because they have been used as hay fields and have produced hay. Some people do graze prairies some, and they can still persist as long as it's not used or degraded too much.
Thank you, Bruce. So a really quick follow-up question that we received, and this is a question that I had that I think I asked you at one point, which is, do we know what the longest lived prairie perennial species are?
Um, and I would have to say no. I have never heard, actual um, longevity records for plants. From what I have understood, I know that some plants they've been able to like date root systems, clumps of root systems that have growth rings almost like trees. And I know they've gotten those of a number of decades. I've heard it speculated that, it's probably much longer, maybe centuries, maybe just like with the trees. But I've never really heard actual dates affixed to different species and what would be like, have kind of the record of the longest lived plants. I've never heard any dates given to that.
Thank you. So on the question of protecting remnants, has MPF identified other remnant sites in Missouri that we are trying to acquire?
Um, we don't know every bit of what might still be out there, but we do have some pretty good ideas. The Conservation Department for many years has had a natural heritage database where they basically kind of keep track of occurrences of rare species and also rare communities. And so besides rare species on prairies, natural communities are also kind of rated as to how rare they are. And all the prairie communities in Missouri are rated within like the top 2 most endangered categories. So the prairies themselves are known for being rare as well as particular species in them. And so that database does have in it basically the remnant prairies that are known. But sometimes just driving by on roads or that, it's hard to see everything at every time, at all the time. And so occasionally new remnant prairies are sort of added to the list or are found. Unfortunately, it also indicates what we're losing as some of these remnant prairies continue to be lost. But because of that, we do have a pretty good idea of what remnant prairies are out there. That's how we're able to have estimates like now there's probably less than 40,000 acres of prairie left in Missouri out of like 15 million acres originally. It's now down to probably 40,000, under 40,000 acres that are left or thereabouts. And that's by looking at these databases. So if somebody, if we find out that there's a piece of property for sale, we can check and see if it does have a known remnant prairie on it, or we can go out and take a look to see if it might still be one that wasn't already known about. But because of that, we do have at least some idea of what may be out there.
Thank you, Bruce. And one thing that I will note about this is that we have a pretty good idea of where a lot of historical prairie was in Missouri. So the map that was shown very early on, pointing out Friendly Prairie and Pettis County in the video, was a map of historical prairie where those 15 million acres of prairie in Missouri were. And so that helps us when, a property might become available, or, there may be something that, we, need to learn more about. There is information in there's information that we have about kind of what the extent of prairie was in Missouri and where there was likely to have been a prairie community versus another type of community.
Yep.
So
that's a very well known, the pre-settlement prairie map by
yeah.
Walter has been a very important tool for years in showing us where the prairie was. Yep.
So back to friendly prairie in particular, we did mention that the regal fritillary is a species of conservation concern. But are there plant species on friendly prairie that are species of conservation concern?
At Friendly Prairie, the only plant species of conservation concern that we know of is the Mead's milkweed. And Mead's milkweed is a state listed species, but it's also federally listed. It's one of about 3 federally listed species we have on our MPF prairies. So Mead's milkweed, a species of milkweed, has been known from Friendly Prairie. I don't think I myself have ever seen it there, but it has been recorded there several times and as recently as maybe about 10 or 12 years ago. So that was the one plant species that was known from Friendly Prairie. There are several animal species besides the regal fritillary. There's also a bee, a particular species of bee that's state listed. There's also rattlesnake master stem borer moth has been found there, and a prairie mole cricket. So those are the species of conservation concern at Friendly Prairie. But even species that aren't of conservation concern, especially like I mentioned, those remnant dependent species are very high priority because of what they tell us ecologically about the importance of that site.
Thank you. We also had a question, and I don't remember seeing this on our hike, but maybe you did, Bruce. Did we happen to run into any eastern gamma grass on Friendly Prairie?
That's a good question. And well, let's see. I think I may have seen it, but I'll check here real quick to see if it's on the list from there. I think it may have seen a clump or two, but it certainly was not, didn't really stand out the day when we were out there. Yep, eastern gamma grass is on the list, so it is found on the prairie. Like I say, I may have seen a clump or two, but yeah, there wasn't very much of it. Like sometimes or on some prairies where you see lots of it.
Thank you. So another thing that we did see when we were out on the prairie was that cicada that the golden garden spider had caught. And one question we got was, can you talk a little bit about the different species of cicadas that we might see on the prairie?
Okay, well, I'm certainly not an entomologist, so I'm not real familiar with them, but there are several species that you do find typically out in prairies. There's some that are in the woods. There's the periodical cicadas that were out in some parts of Missouri this year that I think mostly are in more wooded areas. And in fact, I think their larvae like fasten on, kind of tap onto tree roots, and that's how they spend most of their life cycle underground. But there are at least several different kinds that can be found in prairies. I know there's a big, and they're called annual cicadas. I think they still spend many years underground, feeding as nymphs or larvae underground. But instead of coming out in mass, every 13 or 17 years, some come out every year. So there's not just like 1 year old, but there are some coming out each year. And so they're referred to as annual cicadas. And I know there's especially one real noticeable one of the larger annual cicadas, which is, I think, typically called the grassland cicada. And so we find that on many of our prairies. But there are several others that we do sometimes see. I'm not sure which species they are, but like the one we saw in the garden spider web, it looked to me like it was smaller than the typical grassland cicada that we normally see is quite a bit bigger than that. But as to just which species that one was, I'm not sure.
Thank you, Bruce. And it can be a little bit hard to make an insect ID when the insect is all wrapped
Yeah,
up
right.
by a weaving spider.
Yeah.
But that one was on the smaller side, and we were close to kind of the woodland edge
Hmm.
down in the draw there. So it could have
Yep.
come from where it was a more treed area. We did get a couple of questions about what the plant is in my Zoom background, that
Oh.
yellow flower. And that is rigid goldenrod that we saw out on Friendly Prairie during our hike. I think there's some blue sage there too. And I think a liatris. Anything else
Mhm.
of note in this photo, Bruce?
That's what it looks like to me, the rigid goldenrod, the blue sage, and then that's probably the rough blazing star, Liatris aspera. Um, but those are the ones I can see in flower there. But we did for sure see quite a few patches of the rigid goldenrod were out on Friendly Prairie that day.
Yeah. And it is a really, really beautiful to have those like pops of yellow in kind of clumps out on the prairie in the
Yeah.
fall.
And the rigid goldenrod, just like the showy goldenrod we mentioned, when it's actually in flower, and that's one of the latest blooming plants on the prairie. And for goldenrods, they seem to have what looks to me like much larger flowers. And so they really are very attractive plants.
So speaking of beautiful prairie plants, but outside of the remnant setting, we had a couple of questions about growing remnant dependent species in backyard gardens.
Mhm.
So one question was, are those species typically more difficult to grow in like a planned landscape setting?
Yeah, it kind of depends. Some species are grow fairly readily. Rattlesnake master is one of them, but I think also perhaps like pale purple cone flowers, and I would think maybe like the pearly topped ironweed and the finger coreopsis, and so some I think can probably be grown fairly readily. However, like was pointed out, even though you can grow those pretty readily out on the landscape, you really just don't see them popping up anywhere except around the prairie. You'll see them there, but like rattlesnake master, even though you can grow it pretty easily, you just don't see it around anywhere except what seems to be a good unplowed remnant prairie. Um, so some can be grown. There's a number though that are very difficult. And I don't know if they can be, but at least it's very difficult. I know I've heard like lead plant can be, very hard to get started. A couple of the violets that are well, especially one of them, the prairie violet, is really a remnant dependent species, and it's very difficult to get started. A few of them, like the blue hearts, are actually what's considered to be, I think, kind of like a hemiparasite. So it probably needs the right plants around it to kind of tap into. So some of the plants that are kind of like partially parasitic can be difficult to get started. So, it kind of runs the gamut of some that can be grown pretty readily. You can get them at some of the different wildflower nurseries, and I think they, can do pretty good. But many of them are very difficult, and people are still trying to find out what about a remnant prairie um, is does it take for some of these species to grow. I've heard some of the recent soil work is looking like maybe it's certain like trace elements, trace minerals in the soil. Maybe it has to do with some aspect of the mycorrhizal fungi and that. And nobody knows yet. People are looking at it, but I think it's still kind of an unknown as to just why. It's just that those are plants that, when we find them in remnant natural habitats and don't find them other places.
Thank you, Bruce. Um, Speaking of those kind of of manipulations of the landscape, I guess I will say. Another question that we had was, does MPF ever try to reintroduce plants to prairie remnants? So the example that the questioner gave was Mead's milkweed, but do we ever make an effort to add additional diversity for a species of conservation concern or in general to a prairie remnant?
We haven't really just introduced species into a remnant. And kind of feeling like, well, the remnant, if it's a remnant and it's got all these good things already there, it probably has a good chance of still having what was there originally. Now, on many of our sites, when we acquire a piece of property, oftentimes we get more than the prairie remnant. So in order to, get a piece of property that's got maybe, 20 acres of prairie, but you have to buy a 30-acre piece. So then we have, the area that we bought that is not remnant prairie, or like Snowball Hill isn't too far away from this one. And at Snowball Hill, it was necessary to acquire about 76 acres, I think, to get the whole thing, but the remnant prairie is about 22 acres. So we had the rest of that. And Jared, our director of prairie management, has been working then on collecting seeds from the native plants on the remnant and very nearby to then reconstruct on that piece. And so we do plantings, which oftentimes are adjacent to our remnants. Now, we still don't introduce something that's not, that doesn't belong right there, or it isn't found right there. But we do plantings where we collect the seeds and do a reconstruction planting. But we don't really introduce things into the remnants themselves. We're more interested in protecting the biodiversity that's actually there at that site. And even after many years, in fact, on our virtual hikes last year on Golden Prairie, each of the two we did, we found new species that was a prairie that was that had been protected since, I think, the 70s. I believe since the 70s, that part of the prairie had been protected. It had been botanized a lot. We had a species list of over 300 species, and yet in our spring virtual hike, we found 2 new species, and in our fall virtual hike, we found 2 new species. So we added 4 species. So even after, being in protection for that long and being looked at many times, we're still finding new things there. So that's why we tend to think remnant prairies, we're trying to protect all the biodiversity that's there. We're not trying to add to it, but to protect the biodiversity that's there.
Thank you, Bruce. And as you mentioned, protecting the biodiversity in remnants is really important to being able to reconstruct prairie adjacent to that remnant or nearby. Because you do, of course, want to use seed that is from as close to the restoration site as one can, and not, bringing it from across the state or from another state if possible. And so protecting those remnants allows us to engage in restoration. Because otherwise, as you were mentioning with the plants, if a remnant dependent species disappears somewhere, there's nowhere else we're finding the seed from. And if that's true kind of at this micro, like local scale too, that if, the seed bank disappears in a particular part of the state, then it's going to be a lot harder for us to be, responsibly reconstructing, grasslands
Yep.
in
Mhm.
those areas.
Great.
So this is another question about friendly prairie in particular, and this is just what type of prairie is friendly prairie? What is kind of, our prairies are classified in different ways, and you might be able to say something about that with the soil type and wet, dry. But how do we classify friendly prairie?
Okay, friendly prairie is what's known as a dry mesic chert prairie. And like you just said, prairies are classified kind of mostly using two parameters, one having to do with the substrate. And so it can be like limestone or dolomite prairie, if that's the bedrock that's immediately under the surface and sometimes even exposed a little bit. It can be a sandstone shale prairie, if those are the bedrocks, and that's actually what most of the prairie left in Missouri are sandstone and shale prairies, predominantly sandstone. Chert prairies are where the soil residuum has a lot of chert. And so that kind of goes into the soil formation. And then the other has to do with the moisture gradient. So you can go from you can go from wet prairies in creek bottoms, kind of even grading into and out of marshes and that where it's really wet. And then you go to what are called mesic, which would be like, say, in a swale, in a prairie, just kind of a little bit wetter area, or an area that holds more moisture. Then as you kind of go up the hillside, you have dry mesic. And that's what most of the prairies in Missouri are considered, dry mesic prairies. And then dry prairies would be those like, say, on a ridge top or that, where it is like noticeably drier. So most prairies in Missouri are in the like dry mesic category, like friendly prairie. And then of the like limestone is pretty rare. And then the more common kinds would be like the dry mesic chert prairies and dry mesic sandstone shale prairies. This is a dry mesic chert prairie. And there is also a prairie swale, which is noticeable, small, actually a couple small little swales are basically little ravines. And so in those, since that was what drains the water, that's going to stay a little bit moister. And so that makes a little bit different conditions for the plant community. So friendly prairie is a dry mesic chert prairie with one or two small prairie swales.
Thank you, Bruce. So one final question before we wrap things up with a couple of event announcements. Bruce, do you have a favorite prairie plant and why?
No, it's just really tough for me to pick a favorite. Whether plant or animal, it just kind of depends. There's so many things. Some plants are like, drop dead gorgeous. Some of them are very unique little shapes. Some of them have very interesting life history connections. And so, and sometimes even just finding something because of its rarity. It's really hard to say. Obviously, I like the ones that are considered the remnant dependent species because I think they add, ecologically, they kind of show importance to the site. But as far as a favorite one, I can just never really pick a favorite.
I think that's fair. And, I think one of the lessons here is that the more you get out and visit our prairies, and the more that you learn about them, the harder it is to pick favorites.
Right.
Because there is so much to appreciate and so much that is beautiful and wonderful about these remnants. So Bruce, I want to thank you. I have a couple of quick announcements about upcoming events for everyone, if we just sit tight a moment. So as mentioned before, this webinar has been recorded and an email will be sent to you tomorrow with the links and other helpful resources shared. As a reminder, if you would like to visit Friendly Prairie yourself or any of MPF's prairies, they are open to the public to enjoy on foot for hiking, photography, and bird watching. And you can learn more about the prairies that we manage at moprairie.org and click on Where We Work. If you are interested in participating in some hands-on prairie stewardship alongside Bruce, registration is now open for the MPF Friends of Cuivre River State Park Grasslands Work Day on October 20th from 12 p.m. to 3 p.m. This workday, which includes native grassland seed collection, brush clearing, and potential fireline prep work, will be held with 5 to 20 volunteers. All equipment will be provided by the park, but volunteers should bring and wear work gloves. To register, please email Amanda at outreach@moprairie.org. If you enjoyed this presentation, we hope that you'll join us for our next webinar on September 25th, where we will learn about the prairie reconstruction at the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center. Also mark your calendars for October 9th, when Dr. Nadia Navarrete-Tyndall will be presenting a Grow Native webinar on native ferns. Then finally, if you want another opportunity to get out on one of MPF's beautiful prairie remnants, registration is open now through September 26th for our annual Evening on the Prairie dedication and member meeting event happening Saturday, October 5th in Benton County, Missouri, at the newly donated Morton Family Prairie near Cole Camp. And so all of these events and more can be registered for at our website under the events tab. So thank you again, Bruce. That
Thanks a lot.
concludes our webinar for today. And I hope that everyone has a wonderful evening and you take care.